The expensive sports car roared through the quiet streets of suburban Boston, its sleek black exterior reflecting the warm glow of street lamps on a chilly November evening. Behind the wheel, Michael Preston adjusted his Italian silk tie, barely glancing at the modest houses that lined his childhood neighborhood. His fingers drummed impatiently on the leather steering wheel as he approached the small, weathered Cape Cod house where he grew up. Sarah Preston stood at her kitchen window, her worn hands clutching a dish towel as she watched her son's car pull into the driveway. Her heart leapt at the sight, but anxiety tempered her joy. It had been months since Michael's last visit, and even then it had been brief. A rushed 15 minutes between business meetings. The kitchen counters were covered with containers of traditional Thanksgiving dishes she had spent days preparing. Her famous apple pie, hand-rolled stuffing, cranberry sauce made from scratch, all Michael's childhood favorites. She had even splurged on organic cranberries, hoping to impress her son who now dined at five-star restaurants. Michael stepped out of his car, his designer shoes crunching on the fallen leaves. At 42, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, so different from the boy who once played in this very yard. He was now CEO of Preston Technologies, a rising star in Boston's competitive tech industry. The company's recent IPO had made headlines, and Michael's face had been splashed across business magazines. Sarah smoothed her simple dress, suddenly conscious of its worn fabric. She had sewn it herself years ago, back when she still worked as a seamstress to put Michael through college. The dress represented decades of sacrifice. Long nights hunched over her sewing machine, skipped meals and delayed dreams, all to give her only son the opportunities she never had. The doorbell rang, its familiar chime echoing through the house. Sarah hurried to answer, her heart racing. "Michael," she breathed, opening her arms for an embrace. Michael gave her a quick, perfunctory hug, his expensive cologne overwhelming the homey scent of baking that filled the house. "Hi. Mom, I can't stay long. I just came to tell you something in person." Sarah's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her composure. Come in. I've made all your favorites. The turkey's almost ready, and I just finished your apple pie." "Mom," Michael interrupted, remaining in the entryway. "I won't be here for Thanksgiving tomorrow. Caroline's parents have invited us to their place in Martha's Vineyard. It's important for my image to be seen there. Several key investors will be present." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched them together. "Oh," she said softly, but I thought... "You said last month you'd come. I've been cooking since Monday." Michael glanced at his watch, an action that sent a sharp pain through Sarah's heart. "I know, and I'm sorry, but things change. You understand, don't you? This is business. Caroline's father has connections that could be valuable for the company." Sarah looked past Michael to the expensive car in her driveway, remembering the beat-up Ford she'd driven for years, making sacrifices to afford Michael's college tuition. She thought of the nights she'd gone to bed hungry to ensure he had enough to eat, the dreams she'd abandoned to secure his future. "Of course," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I understand." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Here," he said, extending several $100 bills. "Buy yourself something nice. Maybe take a trip somewhere." Sarah stared at the money but didn't take it. "I don't need money, Michael. I just wanted to spend Thanksgiving with my son." Uncomfortable silence filled the space between them. Michael shifted his weight, clearly eager to leave. "I should go. Caroline's waiting, and we have an early start tomorrow." He leaned in for another quick hug. "I'll make it up to you at Christmas, okay?" As Sarah watched her son walk back to his car, she felt something inside her break. Not just break, shatter. Years of suppressed pain, of silently accepting Michael's gradual distancing, of pretending his neglect didn't hurt, suddenly crystallized into something else: determination. Standing in her doorway, watching the taillights of Michael's car disappear into the darkness, Sarah Preston made a decision that would shake her son's carefully constructed world to its foundation. Tomorrow wouldn't be just another lonely Thanksgiving. No, tomorrow she would teach her son a lesson about gratitude he would never forget. She closed the door slowly, her mind already forming a plan. In her kitchen, the turkey timer dinged, but Sarah barely heard it. She walked to her telephone and began dialing numbers she knew by heart. Numbers belonging to people who understood the true meaning of family, gratitude and sacrifice. As she made her calls, the autumn wind whistled through the trees outside, carrying away the last remnants of her tears. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would change everything. Have you ever felt ignored by someone you love? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our pain can be the first step toward healing. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned cold and clear over Boston. In her Martha's Vineyard vacation home, Caroline Preston adjusted her pearl necklace in front of an antique mirror, watching her husband Michael check his emails on his phone. "Darling, do put that away. Daddy hates when people bring business to holiday gatherings." Michael barely looked up. "Just one more minute. The Asian markets are closing and I need to—" His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen made him frown. Boston Herald. "Mr. Preston?" The reporter's voice was professional but carried an undercurrent of excitement. "I'm calling about your mother, Sarah Preston." Michael's stomach tightened. "What about my mother?" "We're doing a story on her Thanksgiving initiative. Would you care to comment?" "What initiative?" Michael asked, his voice sharp. Caroline looked up, concerned by his tone. "The homeless shelter? Your mother has converted her home into a temporary shelter for Thanksgiving, serving dinner to 30 homeless veterans. She's partnered with local businesses and—" Michael cut the call abruptly, his hands shaking as he dialed his mother's number. The phone rang and rang, finally going to voicemail. He tried again, with the same result. Meanwhile, at Sarah's modest home, the atmosphere was transforming. Veterans from the local shelter arrived early, helping to set up tables borrowed from the community center. Among them was James Cooper, a Vietnam veteran who had been homeless since his wife's death 3 years ago. "Mrs. Preston," James said, his weathered face creasing into a smile, "you've outdone yourself." He gestured at the elaborate spread of food, covering every available surface in the kitchen. Sarah, wearing her old dress but now adorned with a bright autumn-colored apron, smiled back. "This food was meant to be shared, James. And please, call me Sarah." As the morning progressed, more volunteers arrived. Maria Rodriguez, a nurse who worked at the shelter, brought additional chairs and helped organize the seating. Tom Chen, owner of the local grocery store where Sarah had shopped for 30 years, delivered extra supplies at no charge, refusing payment with tears in his eyes. "You helped my family when we first opened the store," Tom reminded her. "Remember, you brought customers, told everyone about our fresh vegetables. My children went to college because of the business you helped us build." Sarah squeezed his hand, remembering those days. She had always believed in supporting her community, even when she had little to give but kindness. The local news crew arrived around noon, setting up their cameras as Sarah explained her mission. "Everyone deserves a family on Thanksgiving," she said simply. "These veterans served our country. They're my family today." The story quickly spread across social media. Local news websites posted images of Sarah's transformed home, where tables stretched from the living room through the dining room and into the kitchen. The contrast between her simple surroundings and the elaborate feast she had prepared touched hearts across the city. In Martha's Vineyard, Michael's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications poured in, emails from business associates, messages from friends, all asking about his mother's initiative. Several board members had already called, impressed by what they saw as a brilliant PR opportunity for the company. "Your mother's quite the humanitarian," Carolyn's father remarked during pre-dinner drinks, his tone carrying a hint of criticism. Strange that Preston Technologies hasn't been more involved in veteran causes. Given the family connection, Michael stared into his scotch, remembering something he'd tried hard to forget. His own father had been a veteran, though he died when Michael was young. Sarah had never remarried, dedicating herself instead to raising Michael alone. How had he forgotten that? Back at Sarah's house, The atmosphere was warm with conversation and laughter. James Cooper stood to share his story, speaking of his struggles with PTSD and homelessness. "But the worst part," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is feeling forgotten, like you don't matter to anyone anymore." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. She knew something about feeling forgotten. As the afternoon wore on, more people from the neighborhood arrived with additional dishes to share. The gathering grew beyond what Sarah had planned, becoming something organic and beautiful. Children from nearby homes came to help serve food. Teenagers set up a sound system playing gentle holiday music, and elderly neighbors brought family recipes passed down through generations. In Martha's Vineyard, Michael sat through an elegant but sterile Thanksgiving dinner, his mind elsewhere. The carefully plated portions and sophisticated wine pairings felt hollow compared to the memories of his mother's home cooking. He thought of the way she used to serve everything family style, dishes passed from hand to hand, creating connections through shared meals. His phone buzzed again. Another news outlet, this time national, wanted a comment. The story was going viral. Between his mother's initiative and Preston Technology's apparent lack of involvement, people were asking questions, hard questions. Caroline touched his arm. "Michael, darling, you've barely touched your food." But Michael couldn't eat. He was remembering something, a Thanksgiving long ago, when money was tight, and his mother had sold her prized collection of vintage sewing patterns to buy him the basketball shoes he wanted. He hadn't understood then what that sacrifice meant. Looking back now, he realized he'd never really understood any of her sacrifices. As the sun began to set, Sarah's guests started sharing more personal stories. One veteran spoke about missing his children who lived across the country. Another talked about his dreams of opening a small business. Each story resonated with Sarah, who saw in their struggles echoes of her own journey as a single mother. The news crew captured it all: the warmth, the connection, the genuine community being built around Sarah's dining table. Their footage showed something that expensive PR campaigns could never manufacture: authentic human connection. In Martha's Vineyard, Michael abruptly stood up from the table. "I have to go," he announced, ignoring Caroline's protests and her father's disapproving frown. He grabbed his coat and car keys, heading for the door with a determination he hadn't felt in years. But what awaited him at his mother's house would force him to confront not just his recent neglect, but years of taking her sacrifices for granted. The lesson Sarah had planned was only beginning to unfold. Do you know someone who turned their pain into something beautiful to help others? Share their story in the comments and like this post if you believe the world needs more people like them. Michael's Tesla cut through the darkness of Route 3, racing from Martha's Vineyard back to Boston. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, while fragments of memories flashed through his mind like scenes from an old film reel. He remembered the smell of fabric softener and coffee that always clung to his mother's clothes when she came home late from the alteration shop. The sound of her sewing machine at midnight, working on rush orders to earn extra money for his school supplies. The way she would hide her hands, rough from needlework and housekeeping, whenever she attended his college graduation or business functions. His phone, connected to the car's Bluetooth system, rang again. This time, it was his PR director, Jennifer Martinez. "Michael, we need to talk about your mother's initiative." Jennifer's voice filled the car. "The press is having a field day with this. They're calling her the Angel of Brighton, while pointing out that her son, CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, wasn't even there. The optics are challenging." "Not now, Jennifer," Michael snapped, ending the call. As he approached his old neighborhood, he noticed something unusual. Cars lined both sides of the street for several blocks around his mother's house. Light spilled from every window of the small Cape Cod home, and he could hear music and voices carrying through the cold November air. Michael parked half a block away, his expensive car looking out of place among the modest vehicles. As he walked toward the house, he heard laughter and singing coming from inside. Through the windows, he could see people of all ages moving about. sharing food, talking, embracing. He reached for the doorknob, then hesitated. For the first time in years, he felt like a stranger at his mother's door. Before he could knock, the door opened, and he found himself face to face with James Cooper. "You must be Michael," James said, his voice carrying a weight that made Michael step back slightly. "Your mother's told us about you. Some of us were wondering if you'd show up." Inside, the house had been transformed. The familiar furniture had been rearranged to accommodate long tables where people sat together, talking and eating. The walls were decorated with hand-drawn cards from children and American flags. The air was thick with the smell of turkey, pie, and his mother's signature stuffing. Michael scanned the room for Sarah, finally spotting her in the kitchen. She was laughing at something an elderly veteran had said while serving him another piece of pie. She looked different somehow, more alive, more present than he had seen her in years. "Mom!" he called out, his voice catching slightly. The room didn't fall silent like in the movies. Instead, the conversations continued, the laughter kept flowing. But Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his across the crowded room. For a moment, neither moved, either. Then Sarah handed the pie server to Maria Rodriguez and made her way through the crowd toward her son. Her face was neutral, neither welcoming nor rejecting. "Michael," she said simply, "I thought you were in Martha's Vineyard." "Mom, what is all this?" He gestured at the crowd. "The news, the reporters, the veterans." "Why?" Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "Because they needed somewhere to go for Thanksgiving, Michael. Because no one should feel forgotten on a day meant for gratitude and family." The emphasis on forgotten wasn't lost on him. "Can we talk?" he asked, glancing around at the crowded room. "Privately." Sarah nodded and led him upstairs to his old bedroom, now converted into a sewing room. The small space was cluttered with fabric, patterns, and the old Singer sewing machine that had put him through college. On the wall hung his Harvard diploma, alongside newspaper clippings of his business success. "Why did you do this, Mom?" Michael asked as soon as she closed the door. "Was it to embarrass me? To make some kind of point?" Sarah's calm exterior cracked slightly. "Is that what you think of me? That I would help people just to spite you?" She moved to the window, looking out at the gathering below. "I did this because when you cancelled on me, I realized I had a choice. I could sit alone with my pain, or I could turn it into something meaningful." She turned back to face him, and for the first time Michael saw tears in her eyes. "But you want to know the truth, the real reason? I did this because I saw myself in them, the forgotten ones, the ones people step over or look past, the ones whose sacrifices go unnoticed." Michael felt his throat tighten. "Mom, I haven't forgotten you. I've been busy, but..." "Busy?" Sarah's voice rose slightly. "Let me tell you about busy, Michael. I was busy working 2 jobs to put you through college. I was busy sewing other people's wedding dresses while wearing second-hand clothes myself. I was busy raising a son alone after your father died, never complaining, never asking for help." She walked to the sewing machine, running her hand along its worn surface. "This machine paid for your first semester at Harvard. Did you know that? I took every alteration job I could find, worked until my fingers bled some nights. But I never told you because I didn't want you to worry. I wanted you to focus on your dreams." Michael stared at the machine, really seeing it for the first time. The worn spots on the handwheel, the scratches on the needle plate, each mark represented hours of his mother's life traded for his future. "But somewhere along the way," Sarah continued, her voice softer now, "you stopped seeing me. I became like these veterans, someone whose sacrifice was accepted but not honored, someone whose presence was tolerated but not cherished." She pulled open a drawer and removed a small, worn notebook. "I kept track. You know, every visit, every cancelled dinner, every missed birthday, not because I wanted to hold it against you, but because each one hurt so much I needed to write it down just to bear it." Michael took the notebook with trembling hands. Page after page was filled with his mother's neat handwriting. Michael cancelled dinner, important business meeting, left after 10 minutes, had to take a call, sent money for birthday instead of visiting, promised to come for Christmas, sent a card instead. Years of neglect documented in his mother's careful script, each entry a wound he had inflicted without even realizing it. "Mom, he started, but words failed him. Suddenly, from downstairs came the sound of someone playing the old piano in the living room. The notes of Amazing Grace floated up, followed by voices joining in harmony. Sarah moved toward the door. Those people downstairs, they understand gratitude. They understand that time together is more precious than any amount of money. They've lost everything, yet they know how to give thanks for what remains." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "When was the last time you were truly grateful, Michael? Not for your success or your wealth, but for the love that made it all possible." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of unspoken truth. Below, the singing continued, a reminder of the community his mother had built while he was pursuing his ambitions. What happened next would change both their lives forever. But first, Michael had to make a choice, one that would define not just this Thanksgiving, but every day that followed. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most necessary. If this confrontation between mother and son moved you, share which moment touched your heart the most. Your story could inspire others to take that brave step. Michael stood in his old bedroom, the notebook heavy in his hands, while the sound of voices singing Amazing Grace drifted up from below. The worn pages trembled as he turned them, each entry striking him like a physical blow. His mother's neat handwriting documented years of broken promises and casual cruelty. Not with anger, but with a quiet resignation that hurt even more. April 15th, Michael said he was too busy for dinner, sent his assistant with a check instead. June 21st, called to wish me happy birthday, had to cut the call short for a board meeting. September 3rd, stopped by for 10 minutes, spent most of the time on his phone. The last entry was from just yesterday. "Michael won't come for Thanksgiving, says he has more important places to be." He looked up to find his mother watching him, her face a mixture of love and sorrow. The weight of her gaze made him feel like a child again, not the successful CEO, but the little boy who once depended entirely on her love and sacrifice. "I need to show you something else," Sarah said quietly, moving to the closet. From its depths, she pulled out a cardboard box, weathered and worn at the corners. "I've been keeping this for the right moment." She opened the box and began laying items on the small desk where Michael had once done his homework. A pair of tiny shoes, the leather cracked with age. A report card from elementary school, a crude Mother's Day card made from construction paper and too much glue. "This was your first pair of real shoes," she said, touching the small boots reverently. "I saved for 3 months to buy them. You were so proud. You wouldn't take them off, even to sleep." Next came a stack of newspapers. "Your first mention in the business section," she continued, unfolding one carefully. "I bought 20 copies. Showed them to everyone at the alteration shop." Michael picked up the yellowed paper, seeing his younger self smiling confidently at the camera. The headline read, "Local tech entrepreneur makes Fortune 500 list." He remembered that interview. He'd cancelled dinner with his mother that night to celebrate with investors instead. "And this," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly as she pulled out a brown paper bag, "this is what I've never shown anyone." Inside the bag were stacks of carefully bundled receipts, bank statements, and pawn tickets. Each told a story of sacrifice. Her wedding ring sold to pay for his college application fees, her car pawned to cover his first apartment's security deposit, endless small loans taken out to ensure he had everything he needed to succeed. "Mom," Michael whispered, his vision blurring, "why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because you were my dream, Michael," she replied simply. "Every parent wants their child to have a better life than they had. She paused, wiping a tear. "I never expected that better life would mean I'd lose you." From downstairs came the sound of laughter and clinking plates. The veterans and volunteers were cleaning up, their voices mixing in a warm symphony of community and connection. Everything Michael's life had been missing. Suddenly, a new voice rose above the others, Caroline's. Michael's head snapped up in surprise. "She called while you were driving here," Sarah explained. She was worried about you. I invited her to join us." Michael moved to the window and saw his wife in the driveway, looking uncertain in her expensive dress and heels. James Cooper was helping her carry dishes from her car, chatting with her as if they were old friends. "Your wife has a good heart, Michael," Sarah said softly. "She told me she misses the man she fell in love with, the one who used to care about more than just business deals and social status." Michael watched as Caroline laughed at something James said, her usual society polish giving way to genuine warmth. When was the last time he'd heard her laugh like that? "I've made such a mess of everything," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been chasing success so hard, I forgot what real success looks like. I forgot who made it all possible." Sarah stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. "It's not too late to remember." The touch broke something in Michael. Years of carefully maintained corporate polish cracked, and suddenly he was sobbing, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. Sarah pulled him into her arms, holding him like she had when he was small. And for the first time in decades, Michael let himself be simply a son who needed his mother. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he choked out between sobs. "I'm so sorry." "I know, baby," she whispered, stroking his hair. "I know." They stood like that for several minutes, the sounds of the gathering below creating a gentle backdrop to their reconciliation. Finally, Michael pulled back, wiping his eyes with his silk handkerchief. "I want to fix this," he said firmly. "Not just today, not just a one-time gesture. I want to really fix it." Sarah studied his face carefully. "And how do you plan to do that?" Michael squared his shoulders, and for the first time that day, he felt like himself. Not the corporate mask he'd been wearing for years, but his true self. "First," he said, "I'm going downstairs to properly meet every person you've welcomed into your home today. Then I'm going to help clean up, and I want to hear their stories. Really hear them." He moved to the door, then turned back. "And tomorrow, Mom, I'm coming back, not for an hour, not for a quick visit. I'm spending the whole day here, helping you turn this," he gestured at the gathering below, "into something permanent." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's time Preston Technologies gave back to the community that helped build it, starting with a proper veterans support program, run by people who understand what it means to serve, people like James Cooper." He took his mother's hand, noting how work-worn it felt in his own. "But most importantly, I'm going to be here every Sunday for dinner. No calls, no emails, no business. Just family." Sarah squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "Your father would be so proud of you right now." Together, they walked downstairs to rejoin the gathering, where a new chapter in their story was about to begin. But the night's biggest revelation, and its most profound lesson, was still to come. It's never too late to change and acknowledge our mistakes. If this story of redemption touched your heart, hit like and tell us, what made you reflect on your own family relationships? As Michael and Sarah descended the stairs, the scene before them had shifted. The formal dinner had evolved into an intimate gathering, with small groups clustered throughout the house. Caroline sat at the piano, her designer dress incongruous against the worn bench, while James Cooper taught her an old veteran's hymn. The other guests were helping clean up, sharing stories, and exchanging phone numbers, forming connections that would last far beyond this single evening. Michael paused on the last step, taking in the transformation of his mother's house. The space felt alive in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. Every corner held warmth, every conversation carried meaning. This wasn't the sterile networking of corporate gatherings or the calculated socializing of Martha's Vineyard. This was real. Caroline looked up from the piano and caught his eye. Instead of the disappointment or anger he expected, he saw understanding and perhaps a touch of pride. She excused herself from James and made her way over. "Your mother showed me something while you were upstairs," she said softly, taking his hand. "I think you need to see it too." She led Michael and Sarah to the kitchen, where a small box sat on the counter. Michael recognized it as one he'd seen in his father's old study, but had never opened. "Go ahead," Sarah encouraged. "It's time you knew." Inside, Michael found a stack of letters, all written in his father's distinctive handwriting. The top one was dated just weeks before his death in Desert Storm. With trembling hands, he began to read, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. There's so much I need to tell you, so much I need you to tell Michael when he's old enough to understand. First, about the money. I know you'll find a way to send him to college. You're the strongest person I've ever known. But please, don't sacrifice everything like you always do. He needs his mother more than he needs a degree. Tell him about the night before I deployed, when we sat on the porch and talked about his future. Tell him how his eyes lit up when he talked about computers, how he promised to take care of you when he got rich. Tell him I believed in him then, and I believe in him now, but most importantly, tell him that success isn't measured in dollars or titles. It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we share, and the legacy we leave behind. I learned that here in the desert, watching young men fight not for glory, but for the chance to return home to the people they love. Sarah, my love, make sure our son knows that true wealth isn't in his bank account, it's in his heart. And if he ever forgets that, remind him of where he came from, of the sacrifices made for his dreams. All my love, Robert." Michael looked up from the letter, his vision blurred with tears. "There's more," Caroline said gently. Beneath his father's letter was a series of newspaper clippings, carefully preserved. They weren't about business success or corporate acquisitions. Instead, they told the story of Sarah Preston's quiet work in the community over the decades, organizing food drives, teaching sewing classes to unemployed workers, volunteering at veterans' hospitals. Year after year, his mother had lived the values his father wrote about, while Michael had chased a hollow version of success. "Every year on Thanksgiving," Sarah said softly, "your father would volunteer at the VA hospital. He said it was his way of giving thanks for having a family to come home to. After he died, I continued the tradition in my own way, until I started pulling you away from it," Michael finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. "All those times I insisted you attend corporate events instead. All those holidays I dragged you to business functions. I never complained because I was proud of you," Sarah told him. "Proud of your success. But lately, I've been wondering if I failed you by not teaching you your father's most important lesson, that true success is measured by what we give, not what we take." James Cooper approached, standing respectfully at the edge of the family moment. "Mrs. Preston," he said, "we've finished cleaning up. We should probably head out." "No," Michael interrupted, surprising himself with the force of his response. "Please stay, all of you." He turned to his mother. "Mum, if it's okay with you, I'd like to start a new tradition. Right here, right now." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Michael moved to the center of the room, gently tapping a glass for attention. The gathering quieted, all eyes turning to him. "Many of you know me as Sarah Preston's son, the CEO of Preston Technologies. But until today, I didn't really understand what being Sarah Preston's son truly meant." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "My father wrote that success is measured in the lives we touch. My mother has lived that truth every day of her life. Now it's my turn." He reached for Caroline's hand, drawing her close. "Starting tomorrow, Preston Technologies is establishing the Robert Preston Veterans Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million. Its first project will be a community center right here in Brighton, providing job training, housing assistance, and support services for veterans and their families." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room, but Michael wasn't finished. "And the foundation's first director," he continued, looking directly at James Cooper, "if he's willing to accept the position, will be a man who reminded me today what real courage and dignity look like." James straightened, his military bearing returning instinctively. "Sir, I'd be honored. But most importantly," Michael said, turning to Sarah, "none of this would mean anything without the woman who taught me, who taught all of us, what it means to give without expecting anything in return. Mom, would you consider running the Foundation's community outreach programs?" "I can't think of anyone better to carry forward Dad's legacy." Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely. Around her, the gathered veterans and volunteers erupted in applause and cheers. As the celebration swelled around them, Michael held his mother close, breathing in the familiar scent of fabric softener and love that had always meant home. Caroline squeezed his hand, her smile saying she was proud of the man he was becoming. James Cooper began organizing the others, already stepping into his new role with natural leadership. And in that moment, Michael finally understood what his father's letter meant. Success wasn't in the corporate towers he'd built or the fortune he'd amassed. It was here, in this modest house, among people who understood that the greatest wealth comes from giving, not taking. The forgotten Thanksgiving had become a remembrance of values lost and found, of lessons learned and taught, of a son's journey back to the truth his mother had known all along. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah Preston looked around her transformed home, at the lives touched and changed by a simple act of opening her door and her heart. Her son stood beside her, no longer the distant corporate executive, but the man his father had hoped he would become. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," Michael whispered, kissing her cheek. Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Happy Thanksgiving, my son." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing Brighton in white, promising a fresh start for all who had gathered in the house where love had never been forgotten, only waiting to be remembered. What would you do if you had the chance to correct a mistake with someone you deeply love? Do you believe forgiveness has the power to heal even the deepest wounds? If this story touched your heart, share your answer in the comments. Your experience could be the light someone else needs to take the first step toward reconciliation. Hit like if you believe in the transformative power of family love, and subscribe so you don't miss stories that will make you laugh, cry, and believe in the miracles of the heart. To your left, you'll find a story that will make you see life in a completely different way. I guarantee every minute will be worth it. Get ready for an emotional roller coaster that will leave you breathless. Don't miss it.